Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we'll examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have become a lot more aware of the mental health and emotional well-being of our students. Now, what we may not be aware of is just how serious an issue this is. A February 2024 study by KFF, a nonprofit focused on national health issues, indicates that 1 in 5 adolescents reported symptoms of depression and anxiety. This is on the heels of a 2023 Harvard study that states 40% of teens said they wanted their parents to reach out more and ask how they are really doing. Of course, this is not a referendum on parenting skills, but more of what we can do to help students identify and articulate what they are feeling so they can develop coping skills that will serve them their whole lives. This is the purpose of the Sound It Out campaign by the Ad Council. Created in partnership with Pivotal Ventures, Sound It Out offers free tools and resources to help parents and caregivers have more meaningful conversations with their children. To further explain the purpose of the Sound It Out campaign and what parents and caregivers can do to help support their children, including how to navigate the topics of anxiety, friendship, racism, and anger, we welcome licensed psychologist and mental health expert, Dr. Charmain Jackman. Dr. Jackman, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you for this warm introduction and this opportunity to speak with you today. Having these conversations are critical. And I love how you introduced it. This is not a referendum on parenting, but it is a role that we all have to play if there's a young person in our lives to help them, just to check in with them and help make sure that they are doing okay.
So since we know we're talking about young children, talk to us a little bit about what is the state of youth mental health and why is it so important for parents and caregivers to really talk to young people about their emotional well-being?
Absolutely. And so I'll start with, just to give a little bit of background about who I am. I am a licensed psychologist, but I've worked in schools for over 17 years. And I'm also a parent. I'm a parent of a middle schooler and an elementary school young person. So these are very relevant to my life as well. And so I think what we're seeing is, even prior to the pandemic, we were very concerned about young people's functioning, particularly starting around 2011, 2012. But the pandemic has just really made things worse. And so it's allowed us to have a global conversation around how do we support our young people better. So some of the highlights that I wanted to just share, because they can be very staggering, some of the stats that are out there. 1 in 5, or about 20% of young people, report having symptoms of depression and anxiety. And we're seeing higher numbers for females and young people who identify as lesbian, gay, and bisexual, and transgender. So about 60% of females report symptoms of depression and anxiety. The numbers increased to 70% for LGBTQ plus youth. In addition to the typical symptoms of depression and anxiety, we're also seeing really high numbers in suicide ideation and suicide attempts. So, sometimes we think, growing up, we would say, oh, what do you have to worry about, child? You have everything taken care of. But we're seeing there's so many things that are impacting their well-being, and we can get into that. But it also is reaching a point where they're not just having the symptoms, but they're actually thinking about suicide and actually making attempts. So I really want us to pay attention, because there's some easy things that we can do as adults in these young people's lives to help them navigate all the stresses that they're dealing with.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that about that we really need to pay attention, because I want to get into how can we? What are there particular signs that we should be looking for in our students, whether they may be on a suicide watch, or maybe they are just feeling somewhat depressed or something? What are there telltale signs? And I know with every student is going to be different. Every child is going to be different. Going to have different signs that they're going to exhibit. But is there something that parents and caregivers can be on the lookout for to really pay more closer attention to?
Absolutely. So let's get into some of the signs. We're going right into it.
Let's get right into it.
So, I think there are probably about 3 areas we think about. So one is changes in behavior. So I think I'll start first. We're thinking about their social life. So you have a child that, you're whether it's a caregiver or a niece, nephew, whoever, right? Some of the changes in their social interaction. So maybe they have friends that they used to hang out with and they've started to withdraw from those friends, or there's a new set of friends that you don't really know, or maybe you're not really sure about or don't like. We also see sometimes they're involved in extracurricular activities, whether it's sports or arts or, whatever kind of civic engagement that they might be involved in. But now they're decided they're not going, they've quit those teams, they're not interested. So seeing them pull away from their social networks is a really big piece, particularly if there's someone who has been social, right? We also have children who are not super social, but we're looking for big changes in behaviors like that. We also think about their mood. So sometimes when we think about depression, we often will just think about sad mood, right? So maybe they're looking very sad. But we also, particularly in adolescence, actually anger could be a symptom of depression and anxiety, and apathy, not caring anymore. So if you're seeing those changes, and I know, middle school and high schoolers, there's lots of hormones. So you might see those variations in the day. But if you're seeing a persistent sad mood or angry, that it's just not going away, it's not connected to a situational issue, you definitely want to pay attention.
Now, before you get into the next things, I want to go right back to that, because I noticed that a lot of schools now, elementary and middle schools in particular, are implementing social emotional learning programs into their programming. And one part of the day is they have the different faces, like the happy face, the frowny face and things. And they want students to pick the face that represents them. Is this something that kind of would go along with what we just talked about as far as watching and paying attention to their moods? And if depending on which faces they consistently choose day in and day out, that's something that would be a sign?
Absolutely. And I think, we'll talk of this about building the emotional vocabulary. And that's part of why the Sound It Out campaign is really geared to is helping young people and helping children build an emotional vocabulary. So having those faces are a really great tool, but we know that sometimes there's more than one emotion that we can feel at one time. But I think that is a start in helping to connect to what that face is, and then how does it feel in your body? And then if a student is, presenting a face that's, consistently negative, how do we make space for conversation? So it's not just activity to point the feeling, but then how do we make sure we're having conversations with that? And are we creating a space for them to honestly pick the face, or are they just going to do what's socially expected? Right. So I think there needs to be, safety and real intentional conversation about activities like that, because it can easily just become a checkbox.
And again, I just want to go off a slight little tangent here and go out of order a little bit, because you mentioned conversation, and being the parent of a middle school child myself and an elementary school child. How do we begin those conversations? Because after school, when I pick my children up from school, I ask, so how was your day? So that's an open-ended question. But I get the 2-word answers. Right, but I get the 2-word answers. It's okay. It was fine. So how do we get them to, because as we saw from the open, there was 40% of teenagers want their parents to really ask them about how their day was, how they're feeling. But if we're asking that question, that seemingly open-ended question, how was your day? As parents, we think that's enough. But apparently, but it's not. In reality, it's not. So how do we broach that conversation?
Yeah, and I think it's funny because if I make the mistake of asking, and I do sometimes, I will get and I'm like, I don't mean that. You guys know I want more than just good. But it is a big. I mean, there's so much that has happened in their day. It's hard for them to condense it or to give you more than that. So, the Sound It Out campaign has these conversation starters, and they're really great. They have probably about 15 different topics. And each topic then has a question that you can ask. But I think, some of the things that we say, ask, like, tell me about a highlight or a low light. Tell me about something that went well, something that didn't go so well. Tell me something you learned today, right? So the idea is to get them talking more. And usually you'll get a little bit more from those questions. And I think having a routine of doing that is really important as well. But again, using the conversation starter pack, it's great. And actually, my kids love it. So they get to ask me questions too, right? So I'm like, okay, it's not just about you asking about your day. Like, let's check in with each other. The questions from this conversation starters, they'll ask. So we have to be prepared to have, because it's a conversation, right? So it can't be just them talking. So it's really creating that conversation with them as well. Another resource that's on the Sound It Out together.org website, they also use music to help children and parents or caregivers kind of build that bond and have conversations together. So, if you think back to a song from your childhood, right, there's probably a song that you love that you could probably remember the lyrics, right? Music is such a powerful way to engage. And so I always tell parents, even if you disapprove of what they're listening to, still asking, because it gets you into a window of what they're listening to, what they're getting exposed to. And that's a great tool. So the album has soundtracks, music that you can create together. So that's a really great activity too that you can use with your child to build that relationship. And then the third thing on that website, sounditouttogether.org, is guides, really in-depth guides that will, if you feel like, okay, all the things you said, Dr. Jackman, I'm still lost. I'm still at a loss. They will actually walk you through step by step what to say, how to have those conversations before, how you prepare yourself in the middle of those conversations, and how to continue the conversation. But I think these questions are really designed to help you start to open up and have those conversations. So when something big happens, there's a routine about having these conversations that they're feeling comfortable with you and talking to you about their day.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is licensed psychologist, author, and mental health expert, Dr. Charmain Jackman. Now, we mentioned that the website is sounditouttogether.org. Can you tell us, how did this Sound It Out campaign originate?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happened, it's a joint venture between the Ad Council and Pivotal Ventures. And I think it was in response to this mental health crisis and hearing from parents and caregivers that it can be really hard to open up these conversations. It can be really awkward. And, sometimes, like you said, like you get the one word answer and then you feel stuck. And so we really wanted to give parents and caregivers tools that they can feel comfortable and confident having these conversations with their children. Again, you at the top of the hour, you talked about, children, about 40% of children want their caregivers to ask how they're doing, to check in. And I think sometimes there's, we assume because they're in their phone or they're in their room, they don't want anything to do with us. But that's not the case. They do need us. They still need us to check in with them. And I think as we were talking about the different symptoms of mental health, what are some of the warning signs? When you check in, it allows you to see what's happening, to see those changes in them. But it also allows them, being able to talk about your emotions is a lifelong skill. You're going to need it as a middle schooler, as a high schooler, as an adult in the workplace. So it's really about how do you really begin to develop that skill but also to know what you need and then how to ask for help. I think those are the key. I think when we see young people, sometimes they're feeling alone, they're feeling isolated, they feel like, particularly if you have depression and anxiety, you feel like nobody cares about you. And then it's very easy to go to the place of suicide ideation and suicide attempts. So it is a prevention strategy to help provide support and allow parents and caregivers to intervene early.
Now, we know also that if children don't get the responses that they're looking for from the adults in their lives, they're going to go someplace else to get those answers. And a lot of times they go to their peers. Now, of course, we as adults, we know that's just the blind leading the blind. So how
Absolutely.
so how can we empower students, other children, to support their peers with their emotional well-being? Because they're more likely to talk to each other about their problems, but we want to be able to also now empower them to find a good way, a healthy way of supporting their friends.
Yeah. And I think, you talked about the social emotional learning programs that happen in schools. Those are really great. At the school I worked at, we actually had a health and wellness block, and students would get, we in addition to comprehensive sexual health, we also had a program that addressed depression and anxiety. And I think it was powerful because students would then come if they, we talked about what are the signs of depression? What are the signs to look for if someone might be suicidal? And I will tell you, many of the students would then bring their friends. You need to come talk to Dr. Jackman. Or they might say, my friend posted this thing in our group chat about suicide or dying, and I'm really concerned. I don't want them to know it was me, but can you intervene? Right? So it gives them the tools to understand what to look for. And we really emphasize the idea, and I say this to parents as well. If you have a concern about your child or the child you're caring for, sometimes we try to minimize it and say, oh, that's just the hormones or that's just a phase. But responding is so critical because you don't know, that check-in in that moment can actually save a child's life. So I tell, we get a lot of young people who would refer their friends or bring those concerns to us because we had taught them what the signs were, what to look for, and what to do if you see this happening. So they felt very empowered and armed with information that could help. And I think that's something that all schools need, teaching peers and teaching children what to look for and how to support each other.
And I think also now, of course, I'm not a clinician or a doctor or anything like that, but just from, I guess, the informal practice that I've had as an educator, is also a matter of allowing students to find that trusted adult that they can go to. And from my own experience, I've had students who would come to me after, like during their lunch periods. They didn't want to go down to lunch. So they would come by their lunch periods and we would have these conversations and I would help them out in different ways. And then I would notice that they would start bringing their friends. And they would start this is somebody they would bring. I would see them come to the door with somebody new and say, oh, yeah, Mr. Bolsonaro, I brought in this person because I told them that you were really good at giving advice and they have a problem they're going through. So I think it's also finding that trusted adult and showing them that it's okay to have these feelings, to have these thoughts even. But now it's how do we deal with it? What are some of the coping strategies that we can give them to verbalize what they're feeling and to express those thoughts in a more positive manner?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the data shows that having a trusted adult that children can talk to is a protective factor. And so we see that, once young people have somebody in their life that they can go to, it makes a huge difference in their outcomes, particularly connected to their well-being and their mental health.
Now, I want to go back a little bit in history here, a little bit with you, because I understand that because of your expertise and your passion for the psychological help with young people, you wrote a chapter in the book, The Parent's Guide to Psychological First Aid. Tell us about the information that you provided in that chapter and why that's so important to you.
Absolutely. So I think, it's interesting because having worked in schools, a lot of parents, just in my own network, if there's an issue, they're like, okay, Dr. Charmain, can you help me with this? What should I do? Right. So I become that resource. So it was actually really fun getting to write that chapter because I know there are lots of things that come up in the day to day with working, supporting your young person's education and sometimes wanting to make sure you do it right, not wanting to upset the teachers or make things worse for your child. So there can be a lot of anxiety for parents and caregivers as they navigate the educational space for their children, particularly when it comes to children of color. So that was a great opportunity to really provide some really concrete practical tips that you parents and caregivers can use. So we talk from the beginning, like particularly if it's a new school or they're entering a new grade, how do you kind of start to form that initial relationship with the teacher? How do you share information about your child, right? Focusing on the positive, like what is that impression that they're going to have? And a lot of it came from my experience too, because, I have one of my children is more on the introverted side. And, one of the things that you have to high expectations and you have to work a little bit harder to connect with them. Right. And so we wanted teachers to know that. And, inevitably throughout the year, they'd be like, oh, we'd have the conversation because something wasn't working. And they're like, remember, we told you this? Like, oh, yeah, you did tell us this. And so having those conversations early on are really helpful. How do you get involved with the school community? We know that when parents or caregivers are actively involved in their children's education and with schools, whether it's volunteering, attending meetings, that can be really helpful and transformative for your child's educational life. We also talk about what happens at curriculum nights and why those are, again, important to attend. How to be part of the parent, teacher parent association. And then how to intervene if something comes up that you're not happy with. How do you reach out? Whether it's, what are some issues that you might reach out to the teacher for versus the head of school or the principal? So we really want to give very practical tools to help parents feel empowered and knowledgeable about things that they can do regarding their child's education.
Because it seems that we often toss around the axiom that it takes a village to raise a child, but we don't apply it when it really matters. And this is one of those situations where it really matters now that we do need the village to support children when it comes to their mental health and well-being. So how can what are some of the ways that the whole community can come together, whether it's a school community, home, friends, families, so forth? How can we come together to help students deal with issues such as like racism or even anxiety? Because now this is springtime. Final exams are coming around. State exams are coming around. You get a lot of people who get really anxious around test taking time. So how can we bring the whole community together, the village together, to support our children through these anxious times?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a powerful question and thinking, right? It is a community piece. And, we talked about kind of how to support children and how to get children to be supportive of each other. I think one thing we didn't get to yet is how to help make sure teachers also have this content and knowledge, right? How are they aware of the warning signs? So I think there are many schools that are, starting to do professional development that focuses on emotional well-being. But I think that is a critical piece because you as a teacher, you see more of the child often. And so you can also see some of those changes in behavior. A lot of times we will tell parents, reach out to the teacher to see if they've noticed any changes. And so it is important that teachers also have that lens. I think, again, thinking about school leaders, right? How are you ensuring that your professional development does include areas like emotional well-being, like SEL, but also mental health and suicide, right? So not just I think social emotional well-being is great, but it doesn't necessarily tap into the mental health pieces that are more in that more severe end of the spectrum. I think I've found, in terms of community, after school programs, again, think we are at this place where mental health is a national conversation, is a global conversation, actually. And so the more that we are educated, everyone that has a touch point with a child, right, needs to have this education. If you're a coach, a mentor, right, you need to know what are the signs and what to look for to make sure that your young person that you're in charge of is doing well. And I've seen that. I see that happen well in many communities. Some communities reach out to me. I reach out to folks if I know your program. Are you thinking about mental health and well-being for your program? So I think that's another key. But I think, again, part of the goal of the Sign It Up program is to help parents and caregivers, because we're teaching children also like how to recognize the signs for themselves and how to ask for help. I think mental health is one of those things where people can put a mask on and can hide, and it can be very easy for us to miss. But when we are in conversation and in community, it's easier then to pick up on those signs.
Now, other than the sounditouttogether.org website, what would be one final piece of advice that you can give to parents or caregivers regarding how they approach the mental health conversations with their children?
Absolutely. I think parents can feel it can be very intimidating because it's like a lot of it you don't know. But I just say start somewhere. Even if you haven't had conversations before, it's okay to say, you know what, I kind of missed the boat on this, but I know that there's a lot that you're dealing with. One of the things I say, young people, they have these cell phones in the palm of their hands, and there's so much information coming in to that we may not know half or a quarter of what they're getting exposed to. So having those conversations allows us to give them the space to process information, to unpack things that they may be dealing with and not really sure what to do. We're seeing increases in gun violence, the climate crisis, the political crisis. There's a lot of stress that we as adults are dealing with, and our young people are too. And so having that relationship and those intentional moments of checking in can make a huge difference. So I will say check in. Again, it doesn't have to be a huge thing, right? Don't make too big of a deal about it, because they're like, you can get the rolling of the eyes. Mm-hmm. But check in, find your thing, whether it's a highlight, a low light, a rose or a thorn. But find ways to just make that connection and talk to each other.
Wow, there's some great nuggets there, and we would certainly like to thank our guest, licensed psychologist, author, and mental health expert, Dr. Charmain Jackman, for coming on to our show today.
Thank you so much.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.